On behalf of Brown and as the Vice President for International Affairs and also Director of Latin American and Caribbean Studies here, I am delighted to welcome back to Brown Ricardo Lagos, who was President, as you know, of Chile between 2000 and 2006. During his term in office, President Lagos was known for his progressive economic development, healthcare, and educational policies, as well as addressing the crimes of the Augusto Pinochet military regime. One of his crowning achievements was the formation of the National Commission on Political Imprisonment and Torture, which exposed to the world the horrors that had been committed in his country between 1973 and 1990. As President Lagos has said, the Commission existed because to never live it again, it must never be denied again. Para nunca más vivirlo, nunca más negarlo. Today, President Lagos will share his ideas about the current global financial crisis and the policy changes that are needed to prevent a reoccurrence. To do this, we will need to examine the full consequences of what he has named the fall of the walls, the dramatic fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and the recent collapse on Wall Street. The former occurred when many of you were just born. The latter will shape the economic environment under which you will live for many years to come. Since the financial crisis deepened as throughout his political career, President Lagos has been an outspoken leader for greater accountability in financial systems, a renewed role for governments in world affairs, and the need to ensure social progress remains a priority of public actions. He's called for the creation of a more inclusive global governance structure that can transform this current crisis into long-term opportunity. There are reasons for hope for it to be different now, but to realize this promise, we must critically engage to understand how this financial structure went so terribly wrong. As the students of today and the leaders of tomorrow, please join me in welcoming President Lagos and his talk, Coming Through Crisis, a New Economic Model Emerges in Latin America. President Lagos.
Well, thank you, Matt, for your very kind introduction. All what he says you have to divide by 2, and probably then approaches what is reality. I would like to make a small correction, because my idea was to say a new economic model in question marks, and not as a statement, it's a little bit different, But anyhow, what I would like to do this evening is to see where we are now in Latin America. Probably some of you may remember that past April, I talked about what may be the situation from the point of view of the post-crisis in Latin America, and why for the first time, since we are not guilty of promoting this crisis, we have so many cases in the region. Crisis has started in Latin America. Now this crisis didn't start there, and therefore we are just receiving the consequences of that. And what I wanted to talk in that occasion was what I remember last April I said was Latin America was better prepared in a very unusual situation, better prepared than the rest of the world. If you see what happened in 2008, the US economy has a growth of about 1.1%. Europe, 0.6, not even 1%. And Latin America, more than 4%. And then in 2009, everybody went down. The US, according to the World Bank, 3%. The Euro countries, the European countries under the Euro, just to have an idea, is minus 4.5%. And Latin America, 2.2 minus. Nevertheless, if you consider the special case of Mexico, this 2.2 is reduced to 1.1. In other words, the region has been able to resist in a better way than other regions of the world. And now we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel of this crisis, And for the next year, well, we are planning to have a growth in the region as such, something between 2 or 3%, depending if you take the World Bank estimates of the Economic Commission for Latin America. And all this in spite of the fact that, of course, the world trade, the regional trade in Latin America has a decrease of 13%, that our export has a contraction of 11%, our imports 14%, and needless to say that investment went down from 35 to 45%, remittances about 5 to 10%, and the prices of our export down 25%. In other words, in spite of all these very bad numbers, the region has been able to resist, if you can say resist better than in other places in the world. And now, given what is the new emergency of, again, China and India with the growth rate that they have, it's possible to think then that now the light at the end of the tunnel is being seen in the region. So much for what's going on. Nevertheless, where we are now in the region. First, I would say, with the exception of Honduras, you have democracy firmly entrenched in the region. And therefore, it's a different kind of a region when you have a democracy working there. Second, I think it's very important, in all our countries, people know how to run the economy. People know what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do. It's a different question that sometimes you have to do the wrong things for some political reasons, but you know that what you are doing is wrong. Number three, I think also that we know about the shortcomings of the so-called Washington Consensus. In other words, we know about all what was supposed to be the economic reasoning behind the consensus. What do we have with the consensus in the 90s? In the 90s, of course, there was the Washington Consensus, and the Washington Consensus was the 10 commandments of what you are supposed to do in order to run the good economy. The regulation, privatization, free of exchange, etc., etc. This Washington Consensus, it's true, obeyed to the criteria that the government was the problem, not the solution, as somebody very famous say here in the United States. And because the government was the problem and not the solution, then it was very clear that the government has only a subsidiary role. The markets were supposed to solve most of the problems that we had. And then the question was, how are you going to arrange things in such a way that markets can play the role that they are supposed to play? And therefore also the major Bretton Woods institutions, this is the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, they all of them were preaching the Washington Consensus. This is what you were supposed to do. It's true. Mr. Williamson, which is the one that coined the idea of a Washington Consensus, in a later article in '94, I think, say that has been some sort of exaggeration of saying that the Washington Consensus was the right thing to do. But before the crisis, it was very clear that many countries that followed the advice of the Washington Consensus, well, were having some social problems, some social tensions. The fact that everything is going to be done by the market. Normally the market understand better the rules of those that has a bigger pocket. And those that has a bigger pocket normally has a better standard of living. And therefore, if you are going to have a society shaped according to the lines of the market, if the market reproduces the unevenness of a particular society, then you are going to have problems, particularly in countries where the standard of living is rather small because the gross domestic product is rather small. And this is very clear when you see many countries in the region. What happened in Argentina in the early 2000 and 2001 in this century, well, you have a tremendous problem precisely because of the Washington Consensus and what happened in a country like Argentina with a strong middle class, but the middle class suffers so much that at the very end, the increase in poverty in Argentina was something incredible to think that statistically that was possible to see. In other words, the Washington Consensus was under question mark, if that was the right recipe. If you see the case in Brazil or the case in Chile, I would say two countries where, yes, it's true, we apply most of the criteria of the Washington Consensus. But Chile used to be called the first student in the class. But this was the student in the class, a good student, but with bad behavior. Because we did things that were not supposed to be done according to the consensus, which is to have a strong intervention from the point of view of the government in order to have social policies in favor of those that need it most. And the Washington Consensus said, you don't do that. Don't do that. There's going to be a trickle down. The economy was going to grow, and the market will do the rest. And countries like Brazil, like Chile, and some others didn't do that. And during the 90s, even though the economy was growing, we take care to take that part of that growth in order to devote to make sure that housing will improve, that better education, better health, etc., etc., etc. In other words, this process of globalization that was taking place, of course, has also some people that say, be careful. Somebody like the Nobel Prize George Stiglitz, like Jeffrey Sachs, all of them say, well, we are not so sure that the so-called Washington Consensus is going to be the answer. And many people try to interpret what has been the result in some selections as a movement toward the left, as an answer of the people because of the Washington Consensus. Nevertheless, when we were in the middle of this discussion, the crisis arrived. And this is why I think that it's so important, the crisis arriving particularly in the moment of a rather large discussion of what are the right policies in Latin America. First, because it was the first time, as I told you before, that the crisis has nothing to do with Latin America. The crisis, as you know, started here with the subprime, then the derivatives, etc., and therefore was extended to Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world. But there is no question that given what happened because of the crisis, now there is going to be a new way to see and perceive the market and the government. What is the area to be defined by the market, and what is the area to be defined by those that are in government? Until what extent there is going to be a before and after. If you see what happened in the crisis in 1929, which is probably the closest in terms of the size of the crisis, well, you have terrible things and very good things after 1929. Terrible things. Many people say that Nazism in Germany, to some extent, was because of the crisis in 1929. The good things, well, the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt policy, and the kind of pushing the economy again through government intervention very strong, and therefore the kind of social security that you had in the United States since Roosevelt till at least the late 70s, within 40, 45 years. It was the measures taken because of that crisis why you have the kind of development that you have here in the US. And many people will tell you that probably the end of the crisis took place because of the Second World War. Because the war effort, in order to produce the machinery necessary for the war was a tremendous economic effort, and therefore was a tremendous stimulus from the point of view of the economy. And because of that stimulus, then many people will say that you see the end of the effect of the crisis closely by the end of the Second World War. In other words, even during the late 30s, still the stimulus package being used by Roosevelt administration has been unable to keep the levels of production to the levels of production that the US economy used to have before 1929. In other words, till what extent now we are in a similar situation, or if you prefer, till what extent the shortcomings of the crisis are going to make necessary then some kind of a stimulus package of a tremendous size. But here, you know, the question is that in addition to the crisis, there has been long-term changes in Latin America. And sometimes because of the crisis, or because we are talking about Washington Consensus, we forgot what happened with quite a number of Latin American countries. And the most important aspect, I would say, is that now, from the point of view of Latin American countries, most of those countries are middle-income countries. Middle income means countries that in today's fashion doesn't qualify. Neither of those countries, they don't qualify for foreign aid. Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, they don't qualify. You have still, of course, Ecuador, Bolivia, you have Central American countries, Caribbean countries, but all the others, they don't qualify. In other words, the kind of relationship that you used to have during the good old days of the Kennedy administration and the Alliance for Progress are over. This is not a question about the relationship between Latin America and the US or Latin America and Europe. It's a different kind of play. And therefore, if these countries don't qualify for aid, therefore these countries are planning to take a different perspective of where we are now. And the best explanation, an example of that, is that precisely one of the last summits that former President Bush conveyed to Washington was the so-called the G20. And what was the G20? The G20 was a recognition that the G8, this is the major industrialized economies of the world, which is United States, European countries such as the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Canada, etc. The G8, plus Russia, in order to have the 8. Well, those G8, in order of the size of the crisis, was not good anymore as the forum in order to deal with these issues. And therefore, the G20 was the 8 plus, well, the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, plus some others. And the so-called G20 then, they say, well, gentlemen, since you are the major economies of the world, probably let us talk, what can we do here? So the G20 is the recognition that a new economic geography emerged in today's world. And given the size of the crisis cannot be solved only business as usual. They have the Minister of Finance of the G8 and we'll see what they can do. And therefore, what I'm trying to say here is that it is with this picture where things are going to be quite different in the region from now on. It's true. The region still is a democracy, as I say. We all know that democracy is a process, and we all know that as a process, every day you have to improve the democratic system that you have in each of our countries. And therefore, we need a better institutional building from the point of view of democracy. We need a better relation with political parties. We need to make room for those public policies being taken by the civil society. And what room are you going to make in our institutionality for the civil society that are not only going to be interpreted through political party, but this is a problem that we also have here in the US. Or how are you going to be able to use the new means, the INT means, the Twitter, the blogger, the internet, in order to see if possible to have some sort of direct communication between the leaders that you have and those that are supposed to be ruled by your leaders. This is a wild new area. And the Athens project of the new Obama administration go in that direction. If it is possible to think some way by which I'm going to establish the leader a direct contact with the citizens in the country. Well, these kind of problems are similar to the problem that you have from the point of view of democracy. Nevertheless, from the point of view of the economy, from the point of view of the social policies, and from the point of view of how are we going to interrelate with the rest of the world, is where I think that most of the new problems and the new faces will emerge. Because it's true, democracy is not enough. Democracy has to deliver. Otherwise, democracy is not only to elect who is going to be the president in Congress or the city council. Democracy is much more than that, and democracy has to deliver. If they don't, then we are in problems. Why I say this? Because I would say that if you would like to define what are going to be the major characteristics of the new kind of policy that will emerge in the region, I would say, number one, you are going to have economic policies that will have built-in some kind of contracyclical economic policies. In other words, this is not the market that is going to solve the things. We know there are going to be cycles up and downs in the economy, and because there are going to be ups and downs in the economy, we will try to have policies in order to produce a smooth working on our economy. So that when the economy is going to be down, the government has to take the indicators to have the economy going up and make things much more smooth. Like what? Well, I think that after this crisis, the question of is it possible to have a fiscal, a structural budget that is balanced? And by structural, I mean the long-term conditions of the economy. Normally, in any of our countries, what you have today is something very simple. The budget has to be balanced, period. No matter where is the economy, it has to be balanced, period. Which is wrong. Because when the economy is going down, you may need to have a deficit in order to encourage consumption, encourage economic growth, because you can still have some growth. This question of the structural balance is something that we introduced in Chile in 2001. And we introduced that in 2001 because in 2001 there was still the economic crisis coming from the Asian countries, and the copper price was going down. And in Chile, the copper prices is extremely important. We produce 40% of the world production of copper, and therefore copper prices has a direct relation with the kind of economy that we have. Copper prices going up, everybody's going up. Going down, everybody's going down. And what we did, we say, look, we are going to balance our budget, but not according to the actual price of copper, but we are going to use the long-term price of copper defined by some technical people. And therefore, when the copper of prices was going down, we spent according to the long-term prices established by the technicians. The copper prices was sometimes 60 cents per pound, and the long-term prices was about close to 90. and we spend according to 90. And in 2001, 2002, and 2003, Chile was the only Latin American country that has a contra-cyclical economic policy. We spend more because the government revenues were less. And the world believed us. And the test was the following years, when the copper price went to up to $3 per pound, from 60 cents up to $3 per pound, and you couldn't spend more than $1 something. That was the long term. So that means that now, when you have the crisis in the world, the amount of saving from copper in Chile is the equivalent to 1 year budget in Chilean economy. 1 year budget in Chilean economy is the size of the saving that we have. And therefore, when President Bachelet, when Madame Bachelet today say, look, we are going to spend what we saved in the past. And therefore, that is one of the explanations why she has a popularity of over 70%. People say, well, you know, she knew what to do. In the good old days when prices was very up, and everybody say, why don't you spend more? The reason why, well, because the rule that we have is this. Now, I'm quite sure that the rule of the structural, the way that you manage the economy is going to be different. And there's going to be this kind of a structural policy that's going to be extremely important. But at the same time that you're going to do this, and let me tell you, this is exactly the reverse of what has been the prescription of the International Monetary Fund. Because the prescription was, when the economy was going down, well, you have to apretar el cinturón, to tie the belt. You have to tie the belt, otherwise you have problems. And this is exactly, the more you tie the belt, the worse was going to perform the economy. It was exactly the reverse. Now, this is to be something very important. And I bet you that in the near future, most of the countries on the region are going to be using this kind of contracyclical. It's a complete reverse. Nothing to do with the market, nothing to do with the whole idea that the market will solve the problems. Here you have a government saying, look, the economy is too important. I'm going to see what we can do here. But that means that you have to be serious. When the good days come, you are supposed to save and not to spend everything, which is difficult, I know. Normally you have too many things to do. Normally you have too many things to spend money. That is difficult to say, no, I'm going to save for the bad days that will come. But this, I think, is going to be extremely important. And this is going to be the first characteristic of this new kind of model that will emerge in the region. The second one is that it's going to be necessary to regulate again the public and private partnership in this new stage. Whenever you have a country, the economy of a country, the private sector is extremely important. In any Latin American country, private sector is extremely important. In Chile, it's about 80% of the economy is private sector, 20% public sector. Therefore, the question of the public and private sector are becoming extremely important. And therefore, how are you going to establish this partnership? With regard to several areas. Number one, what about infrastructure? Infrastructure is essential in any Latin American country. We talk so much in the summits about integration. Well, what kind of integration we have, physical integration between Latin American countries? You know the geography of Latin American countries, how many highways, how many railroads we have between Peru and Brazil? 0. Between Chile and Argentina, we have more. Chile and Bolivia, we have more. But to go from Chile to Brazil is almost impossible. There is no paved road up to now between Chile and Brazil. When you have to go through Paraguay or through Bolivia, then you don't have that. So, not to say anything about some other countries, but this is a real question. Therefore, infrastructure within the country, infrastructure between different countries, among different countries, what kind of infrastructure are going to build, and what part of that is going to be done by the public sector and what part is going to be done by the private sector. And this rule of the game is extremely important, and this is one area of this partnership. Second area, much more difficult, innovation and new technologies to improve productivity. Why I say this? Because most Latin American countries appear that they are exporting, they say commodities. Commodities is commodities, you know, raw materials. No? Well, that depends what we are talking about. You are exporting a forest. Can you improve forest? Can you improve a forest that can resist 180 degrees Celsius instead of 120 degrees Celsius? 5. If you can increase, you can receive 180, then it's a different price. Then it's a different price. In other words, you can add value to those things that you are export. And depending what kind of values, what kind of export will you have. But this means innovation. This means new technologies. Something very simple, very simple. We export scallops. We used to export scallops to France, and the scallops being exported to France were frozen. It's the only way to be able to arrive there. Some entrepreneur discovered that, of course, if instead of frozen was just fresh, then the price of the scallop will double. The only problem was that since the time that you take the scallop out of the shell and you have that scallop in a French Parisian restaurant, it cannot be more than 30 hours. And he managed to put that scallop in 30 hours in France. What was he exporting? Scallops? Or the know-how to put the scallops in 30 hours? Huh? Because if you're able to put it in 30 hours, then you get twice the price of the frozen one. No, the French are so... they make a distinction between the frozen and the fresh. But this is a small example. A small example. And therefore, what can you add value of what you are exporting? Here, the value of the 30 hours. You are exporting grapes, you are exporting peaches, you are exporting apples, avocados. What you are exporting? And those means also what kind of product will you export? Is it a special variety that we improve? No, it's a variety that was improved in the United States. But this is what the United States like it. So I'm going to ask a royalty from the US. I will pay for that, or I'm going to be able to know in my own. We export salmon. We discovered that the export of salmon is different when you want to export to Japan than to the US. The US like a more red salmon. The Japanese like a more yellow salmon. Therefore, they feed the salmon in a different way according to going to the US market or the Japanese market. What is that? This kind of innovation is different, you know. But this is only being done by the market or by the entrepreneur. If it is possible to have a joint partnership in this kind of thing, and nevertheless, then that means extremely important what kind of innovation and technology we're going to have. And this takes me to the third question. What kind of scientific research and intellectual property rights are you going to have in this connection? And the major element of the Latin American countries where we fail, even though there have been some improvement, but we still fail, is what you have here in the US, where the private firm and the university system work together trying to find new ways of increasing productivity and highlight a different kind of patents for different products. And therefore, since you are talking about middle-income countries, well, now they can go also in that area, where the most developed countries, of course, are today's number one. But this is where I'm sure, and this is going to be again a process where the government will have something to say together with the private sector. Number four and number five has to do with a similar question of changes in the energy matrix of every Latin American country. And the energy is going to be more and more important, given the number five, which is global warming and climate change. And here, let me tell you, you are going to be living during the next 40 years of this 21st century talking about climate change. And in just the world, you classify countries according to what's the per capita income that you have. Oh, you have a 40,000 per capita income. How good you are. You are a great country. Oh, how much you have? 5,000 only. Oh, poor. Well, but you will improve, don't worry. 5,000, you will improve to 7,000 per capita income. This used to be the talk in the 20th century. In the 21st century, the talk is going to be when you say, you know, we have 15,000, we are going close to 20,000 per capita income. And the next question will be, please, can you tell me how much you emit in carbon emissions in order to produce that per capita income? And you will be classified as the good country or a bad country, depending on your answer. And therefore, I do believe that Latin American countries has a real opportunity to be on the top league. Why? Excuse me for this parenthesis, for a very simplest reason. At the world level, total emissions is because of the biofuels, et cetera, I think that you know, but total emissions are about 15 to 20% because of deforestation. 15 to 20% is because deforestation, because you cut trees, and the trees absorb carbon dioxide, and the absorption of carbon by trees decrease 20%. Therefore, emissions increase 20% every year. But in the case of Latin America, particularly because of the Amazonas, the total amount of emission due to deforestation for Latin American countries is 49%, almost 50%. Almost 50%. Therefore, here is a tremendous, a big contribution that the region can do if we do the right things. And therefore, I think that here is an area where some kind of partnership between the government and the private sector is going to be crucial. In the United States, the per capita emissions is about 22 tons per person per year. In Europe, it's about something between 10 to 12. In Latin America, it's close to 5 to 6 to 7. That depends. The richer you are, the more you emit, of course. And the question then is, we want to be richer, we want to keep growing, but the question is, are we going to be able to have a growth that is efficient from the point of view of energy? Not today. Today, Chile is not a very good example. Whenever we have a growth rate of 5%, our demand of energy increases about 7%. Therefore, we emit more. Now, it's true. About 50% of our energy is hydro. Therefore, it's a good energy. It's clean energy. Hydro is clean energy. But still, we have a long way to go. Nevertheless, in the case of Chile, because we have a policy of reforestation, because of reforestation, we absorb part of that carbon, and therefore we have a net, instead of 5%, instead of 5 tons per year, it's close to 3 tons per year per person, because of reforestation. In other words, the question of forestation and deforestation is going to be essential in the question of climate change in Latin America. And therefore, this is going to be an area where I think that from the point of view of growth, what kind of growth will you have? Why? Because in the next century, growth is going to be different. Either there is going to be an agreement at the world level, or if you don't have an agreement at the world level, the developed countries will put a diktat. In the US Congress, you are discussing now a law that was approved by the House of Representatives, and you are going to put a tariff with regard to the inputs of those countries that are not taking the measures that the US is taking. Therefore, wow. Better I don't try anymore. Last time. Okay. So I think that here the problem that we will have is going to be a tremendous one and a serious one. And then the final question that I would like to present to you as something new that will emerge. The region cannot continue with the kind of taxes that we have, and a new fiscal pact is going to be necessary in most countries of the region. With the only exception of Brazil, where they have a ratio of taxation to gross domestic product of about 35%, all the other countries of the region are no more than 20%, 22% at most. Mexico is close to 20 or less to 20. And therefore, it's not possible to think that you can increase the standards of living and to keep the kind of tax pressure vis-a-vis what is the degree of per capita income in that country, in any Latin American country. And therefore, it's my impression that the question of some kind of fiscal pact, agree what kind of taxation are we going to have. It's true, in most Latin American countries still, there is a lot of evasion in terms of taxation, and therefore the first thing would be to stop evasion. So if you have taxes, pay taxes. But the question is, I think, that it's more than that. If you have all these areas, has to do with the question of economic growth. But at the same time, I knew problems to tackle from the social point of view. And this also will require some kind of regulations and some kind of intervention from the point of view of government. In other words, you are going to have social public policies that are going to be extremely important in the region. It's not only a question of growth, it's a question of what kind of social policies. And those social policies now are going to be, to some extent, devoted to the question of inequality in the region. It's true. Latin America has been always a continent of extreme inequality in the possession of wealth. Wealth, either because of the land ownership, wealth, either because of the means of production of the major corporations, wealth in terms of what kind of distribution you have. It's true that there has been an important reduction in poverty. During the last 6 years, 2003, 2008, the growth in Latin America was about 5%. That growth was a reduction, very important, in poverty from 45 to 39. But still, what you have today is the fact that market unregulated leads to uneven societies. And this is going to be the point. Markets unregulated will lead to uneven societies. And therefore, some kind of regulation will have to be established. And therefore, you will have to address the question of reduction in inequality. Inequality in what? It's one thing to reduce poverty, but what about inequality? inequality in income, inequality in education, inequality in social benefits from Social Security, because also that's very important, that kind of inequality in Social Security. Those pressure groups that are more important normally has better Social Security than the others, than the rest. And therefore, are you in a position to have Social Security and a minimum? How are you going to regulate the kind of social policy that you're going to establish? And at the same time, and this is crucial, if you want too much distribution, if you want too much public policies, you will need to take money from somebody else and to give to the others. Well, how are you going to keep the equilibrium in order that the money that you are taking is not going to be as high as that is going to be a disincentive for those in the private sector that are doing investment? If everybody goes to investment, you will have problems from social cohesion. But if you only deal with regard to social cohesion and you take every amount of growth only for social policies, then you will have no investment. So how are you going to be able to work? This is why I say it's necessary some kind of pact, some social understanding between the private and the public sector. The most difficult path for the government is how you're going to be able to transit the road in order to keep investment moving, taking place, but at the same time, part of that investment produce growth, and part of that growth I'm going to be taking in order to social policies. If you have only investment, you may have social unrest. If you have everything going for social cohesion, you can stop the question of investment. So this is the kind of model that may emerge. How are you going to have both things at the same time? In the Washington Consensus, normally was the first part. Only investment, investment, investment. The market will take care through the trickle down. This is not the case. And therefore, here is an area where you are going to have, some kind of specific social policies, very clear in education, in health, and social security, etc. In other words, this is what I think is going to be a new kind of model. In the past model was minimal government. The government only can have a subsidiary role. The World Bank advice was very clear, never picking the winners. The idea that the government can say, I think that these industries are going to be right in the near future, so no, the World Bank will tell you, never pick a winner. This is made only by the market. And this is going to change. And this is changing right now. I like to use a concept of the Italian political philosopher Norberto Bobbio. Bobbio, in one of his books, liked to say that every society has to be equal in something. Every society has to have a minimum that he called minimo civilizatorio. How can you put that in English? A civilized minimum standard of living for everybody. And needless to say that this minimum is a dynamic concept, because as society is becoming richer and richer, the minimum you can increase. What you consider minimum today, it may be not the minimum tomorrow. In all Latin American countries in the early 20th century, they decided a minimum compulsory education, 4 years. Nobody today will say that compulsory education has to be 4 years. Everybody will say 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, and Chile is 12 years. That's the minimum from the point of view of education. In other words, how now, or if you take the ideas of Rawls and the theory of justice, how is that societies are going to establish this? And how this is going to be, generally speaking, an essential part of the new model that will emerge. And this has something to do with what kind of social security at the end you would like to have in that particular society. And if you push me a little, I would say that you have two major lines of development. Social Security, like in the US, primarily through private insurance, or Social Security like a more European welfare state, where through taxes that you finance Social Security. Or you are going to have in Latin America a mix of both two systems, like in some countries already exist. In other words, it seems to me that here is an area that is going to be a debate during the next, I would say, decade in the region. What kind of social security you will have in each of those Latin American countries. And you have different models to choose. But this is going to be part of this new model. The third question with regard to the question of the model has to do with what Latin America will do at the global level. Why I say this? Because it seems to me that what has happened now is difficult to speak with one voice in the global world. But let me tell you that now we are going to a new global world. And this new global world has to do primarily with the question of what is going to be this new global world if this new global world is going to be established by whom? There is a beautiful title in the memoirs of Dean Acheson. Dean Acheson was the Secretary of State of the U.S. at the end of the Second World War. And the title of the memoirs of this Acheson is Present at the Creation. So he says that he was present at the creation of the new international world that emerged after the Second World War. And there is no question that after this crisis, you will have a new world 60 years after the establishment of the other world after the Second World War. And the big question is Latin America going to be able to say, like the Acheson, we, Latin America, were present at the creation? And the only way to be present at the creation is if Latin America is able to speak with one voice. And let me tell you, this is not easy. The European has taken a long time to be able to speak with one voice. And my goodness, you have to see how they discuss among themselves to agree in one voice. But the question is, in so many of these issues, it's going to be essential the world that emerges. What about trade? What about climate change? What about migration? What about terrorism? What about the pandemics? All these are global problems. And all these global problems has a lot to do with the kind of development that we will have. We are not talking about aid. We are talking, are we going to have a word to say about any of these issues? Well, the G20 apparently has a lot to say. And at least according to the arithmetic, the G20 means 15% for the Latin American countries. You have Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico among the G20. Are we going to be able to talk with one world? Who are going to establish the rules of this new global world after the crisis? At the UN? Are we going to update the United Nations institutions? Are we going to update the Security Council from the political point of view? Are we going to update the Bretton Woods institutions? Are we going to update any of those things? In other words, here, I think that will emerge some kind of new international financial architecture. And this architecture will need to have a better equilibrium between the decisions of the market and the decisions of the citizens that has a public interest. When you have the decision to have Bretton Woods or to have an International Monetary Fund, and was very precise. How are you going to establish the rate of exchange between different countries? That was the answer for the International Monetary Fund. And therefore, here is how you're going to make an equilibrium in these new institutions, between the different perspectives. I mean, there is no question. Of course, you can answer very concrete and specific things, like the kind of discussion, no more fiscal paradise, no more bonus, no more, but that is not the real issues. The long-term issues is what kind of institutions are you going to establish? And therefore, if there is going to be a new model in the region, is this new model being able to speak with one voice and to say, this is what I do think, from my point of view, that is so important with regard to climate change, for instance, deforestation? Are we going to get paid? Now you get paid if you plant a tree. Are you going to get paid if you don't cut the tree? It's very as concrete as this. And this is the kind of discussion that you have right now in these climate change talks, you know. In other words, any model of Latin American economic growth will have to consider how the region is going to deal in a globalized world. And in a globalized world, well, there's no question that you will have some global rules. Who will establish those rules? Who will put those rules? When you see what happened in Bretton Woods, most of the ideas were coming from Lord Keynes, the British economist. But who has finally the last word was Mr. White, the representative of the United States, that at that time was the most powerful country right after, we are talking about 1944, right after the Second World War, when we were finishing the war. And they went to Bretton Woods and in New Hampshire to make the discussions. So here now it's a very essential point. What is clear is that if you have the G20, well, that means then that it's true that you can say something. And it would be then the first time that from the point of view of the region, since many, many long time, is going to be possible that from the point of view of growth, is the growth model of the region going to have something in order to be able to address to these issues? Is going to be a particular proposal in this connection or not? And here I think then that there is going to be a growth model very clear. I know that some people will call this a development model, some people will call this a more social democratic model. And it seems to me that probably many people would like to compare this with some other things like populism or whatever. Let me tell you, I don't like very much this kind of classification. Because when you have the phenomena of Chavez, or Evo Morales, or President Correa in Ecuador, in those three countries, what you have before Chavez, before Morales, before Correa, was a failure of the democratic system that they had. And the Chavez and the Morales were the answer to that. And that's the reason why those countries, what they normally put as the major characteristic is that they are foundational. It's a new foundation of how you're going to build that society. We forget about the past, now we're going to have something new. I don't like the past. And this is new. And therefore, my impression is that here there is something that is going to emerge with a very strong way. In short, it seems to me that the economic crisis will make much more legitimacy many of the measures that probably before the crisis would have been much more difficult to present. In the same way that in the United States, the crisis is being an opportunity to reshape the character of the American society. In the same way, because the crisis has changed so much what was the fundamentals of economics all over the world, isn't the same kind there's going to be a change in Latin American countries. And therefore, the kind of model that will emerge is a model where the citizens will have a much more vocal importance, in terms of what kind of government they will have and how the government will shape the kind of society that you're going to have. And this, I think, is going to be probably the most important element that you will have because of this economic crisis. That has been very difficult from the point of view of unemployment and all those things. But on the other hand, has been an opportunity to rethink what kind of economic policies are we going to follow, not only in Latin America, but in the rest of the world. But in the case of Latin America, given the fact that it's probably the only region with this kind of middle-income countries that is not an underdeveloped or developing country as such, this is not Africa, but this is not Europe or the US, and therefore you are in the middle. What kind of model you will have when you are in the middle? And it seems to me that what will emerge has a lot to do with the kind of private and public partnership and how you're going to make that definition. The definition that only the market is going to make solve the issue, I think that it will not resist the test of this economic crisis. And therefore, it's my impression that a new model will emerge, a new kind of consensus will emerge, but the consensus is going to be more citizen-oriented. Or somebody would like to say what happened at the end is that politics is back. And the best explanation that politics is back is in today's crisis, everybody is talking what Mr. Obama is going to say, what Mr. Sarkozy will say, what Mrs. Merkel is going to do in Germany. In other words, when you are talking about the crisis, how to solve the crisis, you think in political terms. You are not thinking in economic terms. And this is very obvious. And the question is that now, once that you take that step, then the next question is, and then what is going to happen with economic policies in all of our countries? And I think that is going to be an after the crisis, quite different from before the crisis. It seems to me that if this is the case, then better we prepare to think in advance what are going to be the challenges that the Latin American countries will have. And if that is the case, I think that probably we can be able to reach finally a better degree of growth, a growth that reach different segments of society, and growth that at the very end are going to mean better standard of living for everybody. Probably some kind of better social justice may emerge in the region if we are able to take this economic crisis as an opportunity to revise what has been the conventional wisdom. It's true. Every few years, you have a new conventional wisdom. Now the question is what kind of conventional wisdom is going to emerge because of the crisis. Thank you.